Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Amy Giroux, and I'm here joining you live from my home in Gatineau, Quebec, to yours, backed by popular demand for our 7th episode of what we'd like to call Some Great News. Well, I'm happy to report today the spotlight is on the North. There was a false positive of COVID-19 in Nunavut. So a big shout out to all my Nunavutian friends that was a false positive in Pond Inlet. So they still stand at 0. Which is sudden great news for our friends from the North, and keep up the great work of social distancing and washing your hands. Today, in honor of my friends in Nunavut, I added some scenes to our set with the Inuktitut and some animals for your viewing pleasure. So today I'd like to share with you some positive news right here in my own backyard in Ottawa, Ontario. Live today, joining us from our own backyard in Ottawa, Ontario, is Alexis Wagner, Senior Advisor at Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada. Alexis, thanks for joining us here today.
Hi, Amy. No problem. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's great to see you. Now, I know in your role, it's shifted slightly given the crisis of COVID-2019, and I find it rather fascinating what you're in charge of now. Could you tell our viewers a little bit about your new responsibilities?
So normally, under normal circumstances, I work within the manufacturing and life sciences branch at Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada. And I'm usually responsible for tracking innovation and promoting innovation in the food and beverage processing sector. But given the current times, we've actually reorganized our department and are now responsible for mobilizing industry's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So we've assembled a task force that is working on developing domestic manufacturing capacity to manufacture PPE and hand sanitizer. And I have specifically been working on mobilizing our Canadian companies who have expertise or capacity to offer to manufacture hand sanitizer.
Wow, and I know that when you and I were having a discussion yesterday in preparing for our show today, that there actually isn't a GB connection to this story.
Yes, so actually one of the earliest companies that reached out to our department with capability to potentially retool their business was Irving Oil. And so we started going back and forth and talking with Irving Oil about how they could retool one of their packaging lines to produce hand sanitizer. And I recognized a name on the email thread. And I quickly realized that an old friend, Andrea, who joined us on our 2015 trade mission to China, was actually works for Irving. And it was just, it's always a great feeling when you reconnect with an alumni and you know that you have friends across the country.
Yes, and that raises another interesting point that I wanted to bring forward. As you and I were talking about, it's like 5 years ago that you and I, we gave you the magical phone call to say welcome on board to Junior Team Canada, and we went on a trade mission together to China. I think it'd be great if you could share with our young viewers about what that experience meant to you.
Yeah, so unlike yesterday's call when I got a little bit emotional, I'm much more composed about it today. But I think that, 5 years ago when I had my first Global Vision experience and we went to China, I had an engineering background. I knew that I was interested in getting involved in understanding how international relations worked. But I didn't know how to attain those skills on my own. It's kind of overwhelming. And so really my experience with Global Vision in China was my first experience with how to form relationships with people who have a completely different background and culture than you, and also provided me with an understanding that if you have confidence in what you know and what your knowledge is, then if you express that when you're meeting new people and forming new relationships, that creates a really strong memory in those who you're talking to, and it really helped me portray or change how I approached all situations when I'm meeting someone new and interacting with stakeholders, whether it be in my government job or just in professional networking.
Well, thank you for sharing that with us, Alexis. Now I'd like to take it to Calgary, Alberta, live with Michael Battis, giving us some updates on our domestic front.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to continue on with the news story about the North and the great news stories we've seen there today. I first would like to talk about Nolanor Aviation, a Quebec-based, actually Montreal-based airline, has offered to give free shipments of food to northern communities in Canada. It's a great initiative to help support those in need, and they actually have started a lobbying effort to help other airlines really convince them to also support the families and the communities up north in Canada who have limited supplies. So a great initiative by Canadian Aviation Airline today. And secondly, to continue on with our Nova Scotia Strong theme we continued last week, I want to talk about one very interesting story about the COVID case, and that being the story of 100-year-old Kathleen Murphy. She's a Dartmouth resident near Nova Scotia in Halifax, and she actually has survived the COVID pandemic, being 100 years old. So if she can do it in her 100 years old and her century long legacy she's given to Nova Scotia, then we can really do anything as Canadians as soon as we put our heads to it and we all work together and really show how strong this country is from the ground up.
Thank you, Michael. I'd also like to mention that the photo that you were showing is actually taken by one of our grads up north in Iqaluit, Frank Reardon. So a big shout out to Frank for getting his first time in the Sky News. Now I'd like to take it to our president and founder and my number one dad, Terry Clifford, for his insights on some great news.
Thanks very much, Amy, and certainly glad to see our guest today, Alexis. And she's already talked about her 2015 experience with us, her first really with Global Vision internationally. But Alexis, I'd like you to talk about what it's like to be a young person accumulating experiences, because you certainly have. You had that experience, but I know you studied in England and you've worked in the private sector as well. All this before you're now working in Ottawa with the government. What would you advise as a young person, say go back 5 years to now? What do you get from these experiences?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think this is one thing that I didn't realize until I started working on myself and introspective thinking with Global Vision, is that when you have the opportunity to experience anything, whether it's a situation that you wish you weren't in or something that you've been dreaming about for your entire life, how do you collect everything that you're learning? How do you make the most of that experience and collect it in your bank of assets, right? So Terry, I know we've talked a lot about this, and every time I think about it again, it makes so much sense to me. Whether I'm working on a report at work or I'm getting to meet the Prime Minister, those, you can accumulate the same amazing experience from something that seems a little bit mundane or something that seems like you're on top of the world. So I actually think it's really just every day making the most of whatever the opportunity that's in front of you is.
Well, I think that's really good advice to give young people. There's so many people today, and I'm afraid even schools misrepresent this. They urge young people to get experiences, mm-hmm. but not just experiences as travelers, but rather to get something more concrete out of the experience that can stick with you. Mm-hmm. And I think that gets lost somehow. And you seem to have been able to maintain something from each individual experience into the whole. So your assets grow daily, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I definitely think it comes back to, it's a desire to do a good job and a desire to make the most of every relationship, and really see that through. So you think of something where you're given a task that involves two other people. Instead of looking at that as, just a bit of group work, look at it as an opportunity to lead, right? And you want to come out of that experience where the other two people in that group said, wow, that's the best leader I've ever worked with. And I think when you try and approach every situation with that, it doesn't take as much extra energy as you'd think to put in that level of effort to everything you do.
Well, thanks for that too. I think that's great. That she really shows the value of teamwork and the fact that every member can gain from it, as well as the leader of the group. Now let's play it forward now. Let's talk about post-COVID, if that ever happens. We're finally free of this pandemic and looking ahead. How do you see the future going forward? If I've in a couple of things I've written, I've talked about it being a paradigm shift for our society to go forward. I don't know whether you see it like that, but what views do you have going forward?
Well, I think that it really depends on the mindset of people and how willing we are to change, because there are a lot of positive things that could come out of changing the status quo, right? If you're thinking about trade patterns and supply chains, I actually think that some things are so entrained in how we live and how we consume things that there might not be that much change in how we interact and trade globally. But when we look at aspects of our daily life, how we work, how we get to work, how we connect socially with people, I actually think there's a lot of positive change that could come out. It's difficult right now to see exactly how that may materialize, but I think that once we feel safe and people feel like our health is secure, there'll start to be more and more conversations about how we can rethink elements of society that actually could be improved going forward.
Okay. Well, I certainly hope you're right. There's a lot of movement at government levels right now that indicate nationalism is on the rise, and globalization would suffer. But I tend to agree with you, and I hope we're right that globalization as we know it through supply chains and finished products, etc., it continues in some form. But there's no doubt that we have to be able to be self-dependent.
And Terry, I think that there's an important distinction too between diversifying your supply chain versus, protectionism. So there definitely is a lot of talk about, domestic supply, but we know that we could never manufacture as much X as we're going to need in Canada, right? So it's about how do we diversify so that we have some expertise in being able to do this if the need presents itself, and maybe how can we work with a couple other trading partners rather than just relying on one country to supply all of this one good. So in that need to diversify supply chains, I do think that there's actually potential to start working with a more diverse group of countries than we typically did when we're trading.
Right. We'll see it all unfold, hopefully starting very shortly. Now, Global Vision is attempting now, and today is a good example of reaching out to new prospects for Global Vision, new talent. This is our way of reaching through the internet and using different social media platforms. And what do you think Global Vision could become in this kind of setup, using social media to drive its introduction to young people today?
Well, I was talking to Amy yesterday. It's a bit of a challenge right now to envision what the core of Global Vision's offerings are going to look like in the next year. So much of what we do is interact with people internationally, and so trying to envision how that will change I think will take a bit of time, but there's a lot of opportunity right now to develop, as Amy was talking about, a more interactive online learning opportunity, given that a lot of people are going to have more time to think about themselves and think about their strengths. There's going to be an interesting shift, though, in when we're building those bank of assets. What do the opportunities look like? What do the experiences look like? If it's not traveling to meet new people, how can we recreate opportunities and experiences in a more local basis, perhaps, or online and virtually? So I think there'll still be that same opportunity for introspection, but how do we reimagine the experience or opportunity component?
I could agree with you more, and I look forward to you on a question and answer session live with our new audience, because that's exactly where they'll come to after seeing you in the self-directed leadership module.
Yes.
And they do a SWOT.
Yes.
And they're going to be confronted with opportunities and the threats to those opportunities. And I know you'll be the ideal one to want to have a session with them, a Q&A, because you saw yourself through it, and they'll think and they'll hope you'll know what the future holds or could hold and how to get there. Okay?
Yes.
So we've set you up. You're the straw horse for this now.
Awesome.
Okay. Thank you very much. And a really, really great video, by the way. I really like it. And
thanks, Terry.
I think it's going to benefit a lot of young people. Thank you.
Nope.
And I'm sure David will do a good job editing this today, and we'll use it going forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Terry.
Okay, well, you've heard it live. Thank you, Alexis, for joining us today on our Some Great News. And if you have some great news to report, please outreach to us at www.globalvision.ca. In the meantime, please, everyone, stay home, stay safe, stay healthy, and strong.